Okay, today we're starting a new section which will take us about 2 days, and we're going to be closing off Genesis chapter 49 from verses 29 to the end of this chapter, and then probably tomorrow I'll pick up the first 14 or so verses of chapter 50. And we're looking at the situation around, this is the closing out of Genesis 9, the death of Jacob, and the actual funeral plans that he makes. Now, as you know, if you've been following along with me and you know a little bit about my history, it is my normal pattern to teach through entire books of the Bible. I've done that for a great many years now, not just in this place, but when I've had a responsibility to pastor a church. And way back in a previous podcast series I did, way back about 2003, in fact. And I think it's important to tell you that I've learned a great deal of things as I've gone through books of the Bible, and particularly because I often find myself preaching on things that I would never have thought to preach on if I'd been left to my own devices. Of course, as a preacher, standing before a church congregation, I've preached on other things. I've preached on popular subjects of the Bible or practical subjects of the Bible that seemed applicable to that church at the time. I've sometimes looked at the needs of a congregation that I've been visiting as a one-off, or maybe in the past I've visited the church regularly for a few months when they've been without a minister, and I try to think what the congregation needs, and then I'll try and preach on that in my approach. And I've also, of course, done topical things, and if you're ever had any responsibility for a church, then of course you need to do special messages, things to do with the seasons or the calendar or the time of the year. But what's really interesting to me, if you take the approach that I generally approach, which is to work through the entire book verse by verse, then you find yourself bumping up against things and teaching on things that you would never have spoken about normally. And that's definitely the case today. We're in Genesis chapter 49, starting where we finished off last time and spilling over into chapter 50. But I do need to say that I have never, ever regretted approaching a text which in myself I wouldn't have thought of to approach, because I've always learned something new and something important, something which I wouldn't have known unless I had approached the Word of God in this expositional way. But what the interesting thing that's here is we're bumping up into one of those situations today, because this is telling us about Jacob's burial, his funeral arrangements. Now, when it comes to our own lives, someone is going to arrange our funeral. If we don't do it, someone is going to have to make those arrangements in one way or another. Now, as I said, this is not something I would normally think about or speak about, but I'm going to teach, if I'm going to teach my way through this book of Genesis, verse by verse, and then the whole Bible, book by book, I'm bound to come up into these situations. And as I've said, let's not regret doing it. Let's try and learn something new, something important, because I know that's always been the case in the past when I've approached the Word of God this way. This passage covers the death and the funeral arrangements of Jacob. But you have to remember, it's important that either you or someone else is always going to make funeral arrangements for you. So here's a question that needs to be answered, and you need to ask yourself, who's going to make your funeral arrangements? Are you going to make them? Because if you don't, someone else will. In fact, if you don't, someone else will have to. And if you can't rely on someone else in your family or your friends to do it, then the state's going to do it. I do believe that we are really helped by this passage, and some of the issues around this thing are addressed in Genesis chapter 49. And I think it would be really useful for us, having looked at this and taken it as a biblical precedent, to maybe think, is this something I need to think about and sort out in my life? And you only really need to make the decision to do that once, and it might only take you a couple of days to do it. And I do believe we can learn a lot from this passage, because there are things that we can apply and that are illustrated for us here in the case of Jacob. So with that in mind, turn with me to Genesis chapter 49, and let's begin by looking at verse 29, where it says, "Then he gave them these instructions." It's talking about Jacob, of course. "I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham brought along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite." Okay, that's the opening. We just need to pause here and think about what's going on. Now, if you've been with us on the journey so far and you've been following us through the Genesis, you'll know that Jacob and the whole family, they ended up in Egypt. That's where they are at this point. And Jacob here is on his deathbed. And in verse 28 it says that all the 12 tribes of Israel have been given their inheritance. Now, we talked about that situation, read about it, unpacked it in the last couple of episodes, in fact. So this is the point where he puts his sons in charge and he's telling them how to take care of his funeral arrangements. Earlier in the book of Genesis, namely last chapter, a couple of chapters back, chapter 47, he made Joseph promise that when he passed away, he would not be buried in Egypt, but he would be taken back to Canaan. And here he is calling all of his sons together and making sure they understand and make the same promise. So the point of these opening verses is simply to tell us how Jacob tells his son to bury him back in Canaan in the cemetery plot that his grandfather Abraham purchased, the one that Abraham, Isaac, and their wives are already buried in. Verse 31 that then picks up the text. "There Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried. And there I buried Leah, the field and the cave in it, which was bought from the Hittites." So this is just telling us again the detail of what's happened before and who's already buried there. But there's really deep significance beyond just the funeral arrangements and where the burial being made here. We need to think about why he wants to be buried here. What's going on beyond the basic planning? Well, the answer is it's important to remember and understand that God promised that land to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those were the actual words of the covenant promise. And by Jacob saying, "I should be buried back there in that land," well, for him, it's an expression, an act of faith. He's actually saying, God promised the land, and that's where I want to be buried. I'm not there now, but that's my home. They're all in Egypt at the moment, remember, but he's actually saying, I still believe the covenant of God, the promise of God. I'm still standing on the faithfulness of God, and I want you to take me back to Canaan, and I want you to bury me there. The story continues in verse 33. When Jacob had finished giving these instructions to his sons, he drew his feet up into his bed and breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. So I said he was on his bed, and it's meant literally, because it actually says he drew up his feet and breathed his last. As we would say today, he curled up and died. Once he'd given these instructions concerning his burial, he just lay down and died, one would assume, in peace. And the interesting phrase is used to describe what happens then, where it says he was gathered to his people. So after his death, it's telling us he's gathered to where his people were. After his death, he's gathered to where his people were. Abraham, Isaac, and all his past relatives. Can you see what's happening here? This is one of the earliest verses in the Bible that clearly indicates that there is life after death. In general, the Old Testament, well, it talks about the earth, and it talks about life, and it talks about events, and it talks about life on earth. But every once in a while, you'll get these little verses that refer to life after death. They're just glimpses here in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, of course, they come frequently and fast. The New Testament is full of clear declarations about life after death. For example, 2 Corinthians 5 verse 1 says, "For we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens." That famous verse, John 3:16, tells us that God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son. Whosoever believes in him shall have everlasting life. As clear as can be there. And then John 14:1-3, a verse that is a great comfort to many at funerals, where we tell people, "Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself. That's where I am, that you may be there also." What a great comfort that is. The words of Jesus giving us the promise of eternal future life and rest with him. All these kinds of verses are talking about life after death. But here in Genesis, this is one of those rare places where it's found in the Old Testament. And it's significant. It's significant because it's the first time in Bible salvation history that Bible experts say that it is clearly mentioned. Now, there are two parts to this passage that we're going to look at over these 2 days I'm spending looking at this issue. And the first is today, which is these closing verses of chapter 49. And tomorrow we're going to look at the opening verses in chapter 50, which will relate to the actual events around the journey and the practical burial of Jacob. But in closing off chapter 49 today, I want to simply make a couple of points. Firstly, what's going on in these verses is an illustration of Jacob's faith. That's the big picture here. He's trusting the Lord down to his very last breath on earth. And the New Testament puts a premium on all of us should be living and dying that way. We are to endure in our faith, remain steadfast in our faith to the very end. We could go through a number of verses to talk about that and how much we are recommended and commended and compelled and encouraged to do that. I don't have time to read them all, but I'll give you some verses and look them up in your own time if you like. Matthew 24 verse 13, Romans 5 verse 3, Philippians 4 verse 13, Hebrews 12:12, and the opening of James chapter 1 verses 2 and 3. I could in fact go on and on and on. There are probably hundreds of verses that offer us this encouragement. This is definitely what God wants us to do. He wants us to trust him today, but he also wants us to trust and believe in him and endure in our faith till the day we die, till the race is run. The New Testament puts a real premium on enduring. I think within the New Testament is teaching that tells us that this is exceptionally important in the way in which we live our lives. But it also frames it within the fact by telling us that our place in heaven is secure. It wants to encourage us. It wants to assure us that nothing can change yet. Yet this side of eternity, it is reminding us that we will have to face great trials. Nonetheless a trial than the last weeks of our life, where for most of us physical deterioration will be experienced in those last days. But by enduring in our faith, we will be rewarded, and we will be rewarded with an eternity in heaven with the God who saved us. But also we will be rewarded in other ways at the judgment seat of Christ. Now, different groups of Christians have different views about what heaven looks like exactly, but all Christians across all denominations and ways of thinking recognize that the Bible puts a real premium on how important it is to endure in our faith until the very end. And of course, that's what Jacob is seen to do here. And the second point I'd like to pull out of this is he's trusting the Lord, but at the same time, he's making practical arrangements, even funeral arrangements. And that's what I was saying in the introduction to this. This is not something I would normally expect to speak about in a church setting. Well, maybe I should. Maybe when so many churches are struggling financially, it would be a good thing to get believers to think about what happens to their resources when they die. Lots of people struggle in the day to live and to give out of their income, even when they want to. If their income is limited, they really struggle. But perhaps some of us could more readily be able to leave a gift as a legacy to their church or their community or a mission which they have supported in this life. Like I said at the beginning, sooner or later, someone is going to make your funeral arrangements, and if you haven't done so, or if you don't leave a will, then someone else is going to do those things for you. Someone else will make the funeral arrangements, and someone else will decide how your assets are distributed. And the person who will do that will be either the person that you appoint, and if you haven't made any plans, then the person who will decide how your assets are distributed will be a representative of a civil entity, what is called the Court of Probate in this country, or the equivalent of in your country. If you don't make a decision as to how your assets are distributed, a state-employed civil servant will decide how they are shared out after you've died. I do believe we need to think about this. I do, as Christians, think we need to respond to this fact, and I think this Old Testament passage helps us to do that. So what did Jacob do? What were the details? What arrangement did he make? And what kind of arrangement should we make? I'm going to talk more about this later, but at this point, let me suggest that the bare minimum you should do is you should decide your final method of committal and the type of service you would like. Abraham did it. Isaac did it. In this case, they wanted to be buried in the family plot. Jacob was buried in the family plot, and their wives were buried in the family plot as well. So this tells me the bare minimum you should do is choose your method of dispatch. It's biblical. You ought to do it. You shouldn't leave that as a pressure on your family to try and figure out what you would have wanted. Because if you don't, and you can do that at the same time by leaving it as a statement in your will. As an ex-pastor, I say that it's important to do this because I've seen situations where a person didn't do that, and at the worst possible moment for a family, when they just want to mourn, they suddenly find themselves having to make these decisions that they feel are really important, and maybe different members of the family have different ideas about what the dearly departed would have wanted. They have to go and do things like this and figure out what to do and how it ought to be done. And that ought to have been dealt with way before the time when it was necessary, because they can just look at it together and say, this is what he or she would have wanted. Now, I know this is not an exciting subject to talk about, not even on a rainy day like today, but it is one that I believe is necessary, and the older you get, the more necessary it becomes. But here, I want to ground it back and recognize that what we are talking about here is the faith of Jacob, and how by the arrangements he was making, he was demonstrating that he was trusting the Lord to the very end, and that his arrangements in fact indicated his faith. That's what's going on here, and that is what we should do also. So Jacob dies, and now they're going to bury him, and that will be described for us in the beginning of the next chapter. And we shall pick that up tomorrow and discuss how it should influence how we should plan for the same events after we too have gone home to be with the Lord. Okay, at this, friends, we're beginning in chapter 50, verse 1, and we're going to look at the actual funeral that takes place. He dies at the end of chapter 49, we saw that, and these opening 14 verses of chapter 50 look at the impact on the family and what the practical arrangements and what's involved in the funeral of Joseph.
So 50 verse 1 begins by telling us that Joseph threw himself on his father and wept over him and kissed him. Now, you might call Joseph Jacob's favorite son. He's referred to that way several times in Genesis. And clearly this young man, Joseph, is grieved. He's bereaved and he cries. He falls on his father and cries. And all that is perfectly legitimate. Whether it be man or woman, in a sense, that's how it ought to be. Emotion does not show a lack of faith. It's just the lack of the reality of the personal loss we experience with the death of someone close to us in our lives. The Apostle Paul dealt with this situation because when he'd founded a church in Thessalonica, after he left the town, some of the people apparently died. A number of the members of the congregation died, and Paul felt he needed to address the question of the loss, the loneliness, the grieving their experience. And in chapter 4 of his letter to Thessalonica, he reminds them that we do not experience sorrow as others who have no hope. And then he reminds them that God's going to raise them up one day when Jesus returns. So he says, don't worry about them, but he accepts the fact that they're grieving, and he says, comfort one another with these words. With that knowledge, we should be comforted. But what intrigues me is it says, we do not sorrow as others who have no hope, which tells me there are two types of sorrow. You can be sorrowful and have no hope, and of course that would be deeply, deeply painful. Or you could be a believer in Jesus Christ and know if that person departed was also a believer, that yes, you will sorrow, but only up to a point, because you know that you will be gathered with them one day in the presence of the Lord, absent in the body, but present with the Lord. So to be upset at the loss of someone near and dear in this side of eternity is, of course, totally, perfectly legitimate. But friends, you don't have to see it as the end of everything. You don't have to see it like others who have no belief and therefore have no hope. For the promise of the Bible is indeed, we will see them again. Remember the very last verse of the previous chapter where it said, after Jacob died, he was gathered to his people. Joseph knew he was going to see him again one day in the future. Now, there's no chapter break in the Hebrew text. That's important. So we can quite legitimately put these two verses together and know that when we die, we will be gathered together with our people and we will see each other again one day. The text continues in verse 2. Then Joseph directed the physicians in his service to embalm his father Israel. So the physicians embalmed him, taking a full 40 days, for that was the time required for embalming, and the Egyptians mourned him for 70 days. Remember where they are when this death of Jacob occurs. They're in Egypt, and what they're doing here with the embalming would be the normal thing to do in Egypt. And if you think about it practically, it was probably a good thing that they did it if they were going to take Jacob's remains back to Israel and bury them there. And we're going to see in a minute, he's taken back to Israel and he's brought to the specific site that he's mentioned and buried there. But it says the Egyptians mourn him for 70 days, which is interesting, isn't it? Apparently that was their custom, which leads me to say that, of course, what we can learn from that is it's also perfectly normal for people to grieve. This family have lost a loved one and they mourn, and that's normal, and that's the case here. But here we're told they're mourned for 70 days, which is a long period of time. In fact, it's only 2 days fewer than the mourning period described for the death of a pharaoh. So this was clearly a big deal, even in the land of Egypt. For more than 2 months they mourn. They go through some sort of mourning or grieving process for Jacob, Joseph's father, which is interesting, isn't it? It then tells us in verse 4 and 5, when the days of mourning had passed, Joseph said to Pharaoh's court, if I have found favor in your eyes, speak to Pharaoh for me, Tell him my father made me swear an oath and said, I'm about to die. Bury me in the tomb I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. Now let me go and bury my father, and then I will return. Now this strikes me as rather interesting, because remember, he's second in command in Egypt. Pharaoh put him in charge, but here Joseph didn't go to Pharaoh direct. He went to the court and told them of the promise he'd made when he swore that he would return and bury his father in Canaan. And he asks their permission to go and promises that if they let him go, he'll come back again. I wonder why he went through the officials of the court instead of going directly to Pharaoh himself. Well, having read around in this, I believe most likely this was because that there was actually a rule in Egypt that those in mourning were not permitted in Pharaoh's presence. So as we can tell, that's a good reason that Joseph didn't do this. And it's also maybe worth noting that Joseph, by doing it this way, avoids directly mentioning to Pharaoh what Jacob said about his allegiance to his ancestors in the land of Canaan. Perhaps he was concerned that Pharaoh would not approve of this, or see what he was doing as some perceived lack of loyalty to Egypt. Anyway, that maybe explains the practical side of it, but from a prophetic point of view, Joseph's request to leave Egypt, even temporarily, would foreshadow similar requests made by Moses to another pharaoh some centuries later, described for us in Exodus 5. The pharaoh who rules during Moses' life will not show any regard or honor for Joseph's delivering of the nation in the past, nor will he respond as warmly as Pharaoh of Joseph's era does to this request. And we shall find out about that fairly soon. But here anyway, Pharaoh replies, picking up in verse 6. Pharaoh said, Go up and bury your father, as he made you swear to do. So Joseph went up to his father to bury his father, and all Pharaoh's officials accompanied him, the dignitaries of his court and all the dignitaries of Egypt, beside all the members of Joseph's household and his brothers and those belonging to his father's household. Only their children and their flocks and herds were left in Goshen. Chariots and horsemen also went up with them. It was a very large company. Now this is interesting. Some of the officials of the court go with them. And of course, it tells us that all the brothers and the family go. Matter of fact, everybody went except a few who are not able to go. Only some little ones and the flocks and the herds are left behind in the land of Goshen. So the small children are left behind, and maybe perhaps one can assume a few adult women to look after them and the animals. Now, Bible experts say the reason the little ones and the flocks and herds were left behind was to stand as a token, a representation, a fact that he would, as promised, of course, come back. This is an implied pledge of choosing to leave the flocks and herds and the children behind. We are told also that chariots and horsemen also go, so this must have been a really large group. When I was thinking about this passage in preparation, I thought to myself, imagine you had 12 sons, and they all had wives, and they all had children, and maybe many of those children had grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. Then they also would have had servants and people who supported the family practically, and then you add to that all the officials of Egypt. So really, clearly, this is a very large group. It would have, in fact, been a very long processional line for a funeral, which in itself would have been a testimony, wouldn't it? Now, I read somewhere that the chariots on a journey like this would have carried the food supply, and the horsemen would have gone along for protection. So they were well protected against anyone who might want to molest them or usurp them on their way as they made their way from Goshen in Egypt all the way back to Canaan, which is where he's going to be buried at Hebron. Now, at this point, something rather interesting happens. When they reach the threshing floor of Atad, near the Jordan, they lamented loudly and bitterly. And there Joseph observed a 7-day period of mourning for his father. When the Canaanites who lived there saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, the Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning. That is why the place near the Jordan is called Abel Mizraim. So Jacob's son died, and they did as he had commanded them. They carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which Abraham had bought along the way with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. After burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt together with his brothers and all the others who had gone with him to bury his father. Now this is a little strange, because if you look at a map and you see that they were in the Goshen region of Egypt, there was a more direct route from Egypt straight into the southern part of Palestine, which is where Abraham bought the field from this Hittite as a burial place. So some suggest that the strange, slightly longer, convoluted route was to create this place where they would pause and mourn and pray and hold a solemn ceremony that would be witnessed by the local Canaanites. Anyway, on a straightforward level, the opening verses of chapter 50 are simply telling us about the funeral of Joseph. It's telling us that his sons, in effect, did pretty much as he requested. They did as they promised. Now, I guess if we're going to put ourselves in their shoes and see that what we can learn from this, then people who are given instructions to carry out a funeral should honour the wishes of the deceased and carry them out. All right, let's wrap this up. I said that this message was about the burial of Jacob, but I also think it tells us several things, none the least of which should be that we should consider at some level planning our own funeral, or our arrangements that follow on from us after we've died, and that something about it should be, in fact, be a testimony of our faith. You see, just by requesting to be buried in Canaan, this was Jacob showing a testimony to his faith in the promises of God for that land, for the nation. Okay, let me just make several final observations. Now, the first thing I think I need to say before I say anything, and you've heard me say it before as we've gone through the book of Genesis, we need to remember to always look at these stories within the context of the overall book of Genesis. If we took this story and keep it in the context of the book, I think we can simply see it as another indication of a patriarch, one of the fathers of the faith, Abraham, Isaac, and now Jacob, believing in God. Now, I've stated this several times before as we've gone through, but I think it's critical. Jacob's burial in the land is another important signal to the importance of the overall promise of God, which is the main purpose in the book of Genesis, which is detailing not only that promise, but how it is fulfilled. God had promised the land to Abraham, and he'd given it to the patriarchs that followed on. And here Jacob is buried in the land, and he assigns portions of it to his following on children. Through the lives of these men, we see that God will indeed fulfill his promise, and for all their descendants that would follow on as well. But some of them died without actually seeing it fulfilled, but yet still they counted on the faithfulness of God, who had always proved themselves faithfully to them personally during their lifetime. Now, the burial of Jacob is important in the purpose of Genesis and in the purpose of the whole Bible to record the fact that God promised the land to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's the words used, and that fits the purposes and the plans here. The patriarchs, these great beginning men of faith, all believed completely that God was going to fulfill his promise to them. Another observation I would like to make is in that one sense that this fits with the purpose of God clearly, and it talks about the faithfulness of God, but it does that by taking us through the stories of the individual fates of these men. And what we can see here is that the burial of believers, and what we should take out of it, is that the burial today of Christian believers should be done in such a way as to give a testimony to the fact that the one who died believed in the future resurrection and the fulfillment of God's promises. As I pointed out several times as we've gone through the passage, Jacob believed the Lord to the very end. And this whole funeral procession, involving all, including some pagan Egyptians, would have been a testimony not only to the surrounding areas that they passed through, but to those who were accompanying this funeral procession, that here was a man who believed in God. And they're literally physically lining up behind him as he's carried back to Canaan. They could not have gone through this travelling funeral procession process without knowing that. So what I would say, this tells me, if you're making arrangements for your funeral or for what happens to your resources after you go, it should include a testimony of your faith in Jesus Christ. It ought to bear testimony to the fact that you believe the Lord's promises for you in respect, and for us it is in respect to life after death. If you're listening to this message and you've learned to trust the Lord just a little bit more in respect of your eternal future, then I believe I have achieved a lot and drawn the main thing we're meant to get out of this passage. If I didn't teach you anything else other than you can trust the Lord for your future eternity, then I have indeed succeeded. One more suggestion though, and it's the kind of thing I would never probably have encountered or felt the need to say unless I was going word by word, verse by verse through this book. And that is that you too, friends, should make plans for your burial, and that part of these plans should be something that reflects a testimony of your faith in God through Jesus Christ. So let me sum up and spell it out. Number one, you need to express your practical wishes regarding your funeral and any financial resources that you have accumulated. Now, is that something that most people do? Well, the truth is, a great many don't. But these guys did, these patriarchs did, and they stand as an example to us. The second thing, number two, I think we should make sure that the person or the people taking the service or the funeral or the events following the death, you should make sure that there is something said within it that is a testimony to your faith, your personal faith in Jesus Christ and God. I think it can be really helpful sometimes to put things down on paper for people who follow on, give it to someone who's going to be involved in things, because sometimes, unbelieving family members will try and exclude this aspect of your life from the arrangements. And the third thing I would say, which is a very practical thing, but I believe this passage teaches it, you need to make some estate planning decisions. I've said this on and off for years in a role of leading a church, because I first bumped into this truth in Scripture many years ago. But it shows to me that if you've accumulated any kind of material possessions, then you need to figure out who gets what. Now, it's commonly called a will. But let me tell you why it's important to do that. You see, there's a special court in the land, and it's called the probate court. And the probate court exists to do one thing, and that is to determine who gets what, once you've shuffled off this mortal coil, as Shakespeare would have put it. And its job becomes very important if you haven't stated your preference. If you don't have a will, the state then writes your will for you. If you do nothing and you don't write it down, then a probate judge is the one who will decide who gets what. So you might as well make some plans. Abraham did it, and we see Jacob did it here. And that tells me that perhaps maybe we should do the same. As a pastor, I had the privilege of getting to know some local funeral directors, and I can tell you, you should see, because they've told me what happens sometimes when people don't plan. It would be the greatest motivation in the world for you to make some plans if you saw how some families behave during funerals. If you can make plans, then after your demise, you can be a blessing to your family and other believers, rather than be a burden on those people that you leave behind, that they suddenly have to deal with this complicated matter, something that really shouldn't be put on them when they're really mourning and grieving. You need to make decisions in this life to help people survive the trauma of your loss and all it means to them. It is truly, I believe, an act of love. And I also truly believe you've got a biblical warrant for doing it and approaching it this way. And it's here for us in Genesis chapter 49 and 50. And I do believe that we can look at this passage and be thankful for God for that little bit of unusual but absolutely applicable wisdom. So let's do something about applying it today, so that those that we love behind can benefit, the church and the work of the church can perhaps benefit as well, and also that it can be a testimony to our ongoing testimony to our faith and trust in Jesus Christ.